Jay, have you ever stopped to think about what you would do if you had the chance to fulfill that promise you left behind? The one you swore to keep one day, but life kept throwing obstacles, responsibilities, fears, and suddenly, years passed and it became just a memory kept deep in your heart? Now imagine doing that at 74 years old, alone, in the middle of the ocean. Sounds crazy, doesn't it? That's exactly what everyone said when she made the boldest decision of her life. There, standing before that silent port, a white-haired woman observed an old, rusty boat she had just bought with her savings. The peeling paint, the hull marked by time, the torn sails in need of urgent repair, none of it seemed safe. None of it made sense to an outsider. But for her, that boat represented something much greater than wood and metal. It was the bridge between the past and the future. It was the last chance to honor a promise made decades ago when there were still two hands, intertwined, and two hearts dreaming together. The family begged her to give up. The children called every day repeating the same worried phrases. "Mom, you've never sailed alone in your life. This is dangerous. You could die out there. Please, give up this crazy idea." Friends shook their heads with pity, that look of someone who had already given up on their own dreams and didn't understand why anyone still insisted on theirs. The neighbors whispered in the corners, betting on how long it would take for her to realize the mistake and return home defeated. Have you ever been through this? Have you ever felt the weight of everyone's judgment around you when you decided to do something different? Something that seemed impossible in the eyes of others? But she had a promise to keep, and nothing else mattered. Not her age, not her fear, not the voices that tried to convince her it was too late, that women her age should be at home, peacefully waiting for the days to pass. Because truth is, she had already waited too long. She had already lived too many years in solitude, in the deafening silence of a house that used to be full of life and laughter. And it was precisely in that silence that the voice of the past echoed again, bringing back that old promise to cross the ocean together. And there she was, her hands trembling, yet determined. She adjusted the boat's ropes, checking every detail with the attention of someone who knows there's no room for error. The cold sea. Wind whipped against her face, carrying the scent of salt and adventure. The waves crashed against the dock, as if testing her courage even before departure. Stay with me until the end, because what happened during this journey goes far beyond what anyone could imagine. She had no experience. She had never captained a boat alone, but she had something that many young people have lost long ago. The courage to start over when everyone says it's impossible. And at that moment, looking at the infinite horizon before her, she understood something fundamental, perhaps the most important thing in her entire life. What you are about to discover may surprise you, because this story is not just about sailing the ocean. It's about having the courage to look at life and say, I still can. I still deserve to truly live. And if you're here now watching this story, it's because somewhere inside you there's also a promise being kept, a postponed dream, something you swore to do but put off. Maybe it's time to take it out of the drawer. You know, I created this channel precisely for this reason, to bring real stories of people who decided that it's never too late, people who proved that age is just a number when you have a true purpose in your heart. And every time you like this video, every comment you leave below sharing your own experience, you are helping this message reach more people who need to hear it today. It could be that mother who gave up her dreams to take care of her family, that father who thinks it's too late, that grandmother who everyone says should rest, when in reality, she just wants to live. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below about what has touched you the most so far. What's that promise you still hold dear? Because when you share this, you're not just interacting with a video, you're creating a chain of courage that inspires others to take that first step too. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this kind of transformative content. And if you're not yet subscribed, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because every week I bring you stories like this that will make you rethink what's possible in your own life. Now come back with me to this incredible story, because what she did in the days following her decision to leave was something no one expected. While everyone was betting on her failure, while her family was already preparing for the phone call saying she had given up and returned home. She was doing the exact opposite. She was preparing to truly leave. But before you understand the power of that decision, you need to know who she really was. Because this isn't the story of an extraordinary woman who was born courageous. It's the story of someone absolutely ordinary who lived an entire life like millions of other people, with dreams tucked away in a drawer, waiting for the right moment that never came. Her name is Margaret, and if you had crossed paths with her on the street a few years ago, you probably wouldn't have given her a second glance. She was one of those women who spend their lives taking care of their families, working, paying bills, living a quiet and predictable routine. She married Thomas at 22, a simple man who worked as a mechanic and had that calm demeanor of someone who doesn't need much to be happy. They built a modest life, but one full of love. They had 3 children, raised them all with dignity, and saw their grandchildren born. A normal life, a good life, but a life with a dream that never left the drawing board. Because since they were young, Margaret and Thomas had a secret promise between them. On summer nights, when the children finally slept and the house was quiet, they would sit on the porch and talk about the future, and the same dream always returned. When they retired, when they had time just for themselves, they would buy a boat and cross the ocean together. It didn't matter where. The destination was never the most important thing. It was about the journey. It was about feeling the wind on their faces, watching the sunset in the middle of nowhere, waking up without knowing exactly where the day would take them. It was about freedom. But life has a way of pushing dreams aside. First came the expenses for the children, then the house that needed renovations, then the elderly parents who needed care, and when retirement finally arrived, when they finally had the time they had always hoped for, Thomas fell ill, and in less than a year, he was gone, taking half of the promise with him, but leaving behind a woman completely lost in her own life. Margaret spent the following years in silent solitude, a solitude that isn't just about being physically alone, but about feeling that life has lost its purpose, that the days repeat themselves colorless, emotionless, without that spark that made everything worthwhile. And it was precisely in this emptiness that the transformation began, because there comes a moment in life when you have to choose. Either you accept that it's over, or you decide to honor everything you've lived by doing what you promised, even if it's alone, even if everyone says it's madness. What if true courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act even when everything seems impossible? Write in the comments, "I also have a promise to keep," if you identified with this story so far. Now let me show you what happened when Margaret decided she wasn't going to wait any longer. Thomas's death wasn't just losing a husband. It was losing the only companion who truly understood her dreams, who shared every plan, every expectation for the future. It was as if half of her had been ripped away at once, leaving a hole that nothing seemed to fill. The first few months were the worst. Margaret would wake up in the morning and, for a few seconds, forget that he was no longer there. She would make coffee for 2. She would turn to say something and find only emptiness. The house, which had once been full of laughter and conversation, now echoed only the heavy silence of a life interrupted. The children tried to help in any way they could. They called every week, visited on weekends, suggested she move in with one of them. But Margaret knew that wouldn't solve anything. It wasn't about being physically accompanied. It was about having lost her sense of purpose, that deep connection that only 2 people who have built a whole life together can understand. The days dragged on, gray and identical to each other. She was waking up without knowing why. She cooked without appetite. She watched television without paying attention. It was like being alive only in a biological sense, but dead inside. 3 long years passed like that. 3 years where the only certainty was that the best part of life was already behind her. Until one day, while organizing her bedroom closet, Margaret found an old cardboard box, hidden at the back. Inside, yellowed photographs, old letters, and a diary Thomas had kept. She hesitated before opening it. Part of her was afraid of reliving the pain, but curiosity was stronger. And when she began to read the pages written in his crooked handwriting, something inside her began to stir again. These were notes about their dream, calculations of how much a boat would cost, possible routes to cross the ocean, rough sketches of what the trip would be like, and on one of the last pages, a phrase underlined several times, "One day, Margaret and I will make it happen. No matter when, the promise still stands." Tears streamed down her face, but this time, they weren't just tears of sadness. They were tears of something she hadn't felt in years, hope mixed with responsibility. That promise hadn't died with Thomas. It was still alive, and now it only depended on her to make it a reality. It was at that moment that Margaret's mindset completely changed. She realized that continuing to live in that empty solitude was not honoring his memory. It was wasting everything they had built together. What if it was still possible? What if, at 74, she could do what they had always dreamed of? Alone, yes, but carrying both their hearts on this journey. The decision was made there, in that silent room, with an old diary in her hands, and a courage born where before there had only been resignation. Comment below, renewed promise, if you've also decided to reclaim something you thought was lost. Because what Margaret did in the following days was so radical that no one could believe what they were seeing. The next morning, Margaret woke up feeling different. It wasn't just a feeling. It was a physical certainty, as if something inside her had been switched back on after years of being switched off. She knew exactly what she needed to do. And for the first time since Thomas's death, she had a clear goal. She was going to buy a boat and cross that ocean. Alone, at 74 years old, with no real sailing experience, without knowing exactly where she was going, but she was going. When she told her children, their reaction was exactly what she expected. Her eldest son almost choked on his coffee. Her middle daughter started crying, saying she couldn't lose her mother too. The youngest tried to be rational, listing all the reasons why it was a terrible idea. "Mom, you've never sailed alone in your life. This is too dangerous. You could die at sea. Please, get this crazy idea out of your head." They thought it was just a passing moment of madness, one of those impulsive decisions that grieving people sometimes make. So they tried to be patient, hoping she would forget about it with time. But Margaret didn't forget. In fact, the more people tried to dissuade her, the stronger her determination became. Her church friends shook their heads in pity. "Poor thing. She's become a bit confused since she lost Thomas," they whispered in the hallways. The neighbors commented on the street. "She won't last a week at sea. She'll give up as soon as she feels the first sign of seasickness." Even the doctor, during a routine checkup, tried to convince her that it wasn't sensible for someone her age. But here's the hidden truth that nobody understands. Courage isn't about not being afraid. Courage isn't about thinking everything will turn out all right. Margaret was terrified. She would wake up in the middle of the night with her heart racing, imagining all the things that could go wrong. Storms, accidents, absolute solitude in the middle of nowhere. But the fear of not doing it, the fear of dying without having honored that promise, was greater than anything else. And that's the difference between those who act and those who only dream. It's not about eliminating fear. It's about deciding that it won't have the final say. So she ignored everyone. She withdrew her savings from the bank. She went to the port and bought that old boat that nobody else wanted. She paid less than $10,000 for something that clearly needed a lot of repairs. The seller even asked if she was sure, looking at that white-haired lady with a mixture of doubt and admiration. "Absolutely," she replied. And at that moment, something changed forever. Because she wasn't just buying a boat. She was buying back the right to be the protagonist of her own life. But wait until you find out what she did to prepare, because that's when the journey got even more impressive. Margaret had absolutely no idea how to navigate a boat on her own. She had taken a few sightseeing trips with Thomas years ago, held the helm for a few minutes while he explained the basics, but that was all. Now, looking at that old vessel anchored in the harbor, she knew she needed to learn everything from scratch, and learn fast. But how does someone of 74 years old, without access to expensive sailing schools or private instructors, do that? Her answer was as simple as it was inspiring: the internet. Every night after the sun set, Margaret would turn on her old computer, which she barely knew how to use, and start searching for videos about sailing. She would type slowly with 2 fingers on the video platforms. How to sail a sailboat alone, basic navigation for beginners, how to read a compass, Meteorology for sailors. She would watch the same videos 3, 4, 5 times until she understood every detail. She would take notes in an old notebook, draw diagrams, and repeat the technical terms aloud until she memorized them. Port, starboard, bow, stern, mainsail, staysail. Words she had never used in her life became part of her daily vocabulary. By day, she worked on the boat. And when I say worked, I don't just mean wiping things down and giving them a quick coat of paint. Margaret learned to replace worn ropes, mend torn sails using tutorials on her phone, check every screw, every electrical connection, every part of the engine. Her hands, which had spent her life cooking and taking care of the house, were now full of calluses and grease stains. Her fingers ached at the end of the day. Her back complained every morning when she got up, but she didn't stop. Each small repair was an act of faith, each problem solved, a small victory that brought her closer to her goal. The other sailors in the harbor began to notice the woman who spent hours alone working on the old boat. Some stopped to offer advice, impressed by her determination. Others simply shook their heads, still convinced she would give up before leaving the bay. But Margaret didn't care about opinions. She was on a mission. She bought used technical manuals from second-hand bookstores, books on ocean navigation, and nautical charts that she studied before bed. She memorized routes, learned about ocean currents, and understood how emergency communication systems worked. 3 months later, that boat that no one believed would ever sail again was ready. It wasn't perfect. The paint was still peeling in places. The engine made a strange noise sometimes, but it was functional. And Margaret, who 3 months earlier barely knew the difference between port and starboard, could now handle that vessel with a confidence she didn't know she possessed. The transformation wasn't just in the boat, it was in her. The day of departure arrived on a morning of blue skies and a gentle breeze. Margaret woke before dawn, packed the queue, last provisions on the boat, and checked every detail for the 10th time. Her children were there at the port, tense, still trying to convince her to change her mind until the very last second. Her middle daughter was crying, clinging to her, whispering, "Please don't go." Her eldest son remained silent, his eyes red, as if he had already given up arguing, but still carried the fear of never seeing her again. Margaret hugged each of them tightly, feeling the weight of the farewell, but also the lightness of finally doing it. When he released the mooring lines from the dock, his hands trembled. It wasn't just nervousness, it was the symbolic weight of that moment. It was crossing an invisible line between the life I had lived until then and the life that was about to begin. The engine hummed softly as the boat slowly pulled away from the port. Margaret looked back one last time and saw her children getting smaller and smaller until they were just tiny dots in the distance. And then there was only the sea, the infinite blue stretching in every direction, with no apparent beginning or end. The silence of the ocean is something that those who have never experienced it cannot understand. It's not just the absence of noise, it's a presence. It's a kind of stillness that makes you hear your own thoughts with frightening clarity. Margaret turned off the engine when she was far enough from the shore and hoisted the sails. The fabric filled with wind, and the boat began to glide smoothly over the waves. She sat on the deck, took a deep breath of the salty air, and for the first time in 3 years, smiled truly. Not a polite or forced smile, a smile that came from within, from that place she thought had died along with Thomas. The first few hours were pure adrenaline. Every wave that rocked the boat, every adjustment to the sails, every check of the compass. But when the sun began to set on the horizon, tinging the sky orange and pink, Margaret stopped everything and simply watched. It was the most beautiful spectacle she had ever seen in her life. There were no buildings, cars, people, distractions. Just her, the sea, and that sky ablaze bidding farewell to the day. At that moment, she didn't know if she would return. She didn't know what she would find ahead. But for the first time in years, she felt truly alive. She wasn't just existing. She was living each second intensely. Night fell, and with it came real fear. The absolute darkness of the ocean is unlike anything else. There are no streetlights, no illuminated windows, nothing to indicate the presence of other human beings. It's just you and the immensity. But even with fear, Margaret didn't regret it for a second. The first 5 days at sea were challenging, but manageable. Margaret was finding her rhythm, learning to trust her instincts, adjusting to the solitude that sometimes felt liberating, sometimes weighed like lead on her chest. But on the morning of the 6th day, something changed. The sky, which had dawned clear, began to darken rapidly. Heavy gray clouds formed on the horizon with frightening speed. The wind, which had been gentle, began to blow with increasing force. Margaret looked at the compass, checked the weather forecast on the portable radio, and felt her stomach clench. A storm was coming, and it was coming fast. She had watched videos on how to handle storms at sea, read the manuals, and noted down the procedures. But theory is one thing. Being alone, at 74 years old, in an old boat in the middle of the ocean while the sky falls, is completely different. The first drops began to fall thick and icy. In minutes, it turned into a deluge. The sea, which had been relatively calm, transformed into mountains of water that lifted the boat and threw it down with brutal force. Margaret struggled to maintain her balance, tying herself to the rudder with a rope as she tried to keep the boat on the right course. The waves crashed against the deck with such violence that she had to hold on with all her might to avoid being thrown overboard. The rain was so intense that she couldn't see more than a few meters away. The noise was deafening. The howling wind, the waves exploding against the hull, the terrifying creaks of the structure being tested to its limit. And then, at the height of the storm, when Margaret thought she couldn't take it anymore, the engine started making a strange noise and simply stopped. She died, there, in the middle of the chaos, without propulsion, at the mercy of the giant waves and the violent wind. It was at that moment that the real panic set in. It was no longer about being brave or determined. It was about pure survival. Margaret thought of her children, imagined their pain upon receiving the news that she had disappeared at sea. She thought of Thomas, of how foolish she had been to think she could do this alone. But then, in the midst of that despair, something happened. A strange clarity took hold of her. She realized she could choose how to react. She could panic and freeze, or she could fight until the last second. And if she was going to die there, let it be fighting, not giving up. Then she got to work. She went down to the small engine compartment, soaked with water flooding in from all sides, and began checking every connection, every wire, using only a flashlight that swayed wildly with the boat's movement. Her hands trembled, but she didn't stop, and after 20 minutes that seemed like hours, she found the problem. A loose wire. She reconnected it. She went back to the helm. She turned the key. The engine coughed once, twice, and on the third try, it came back to life. The storm passed after 6 interminable hours. When the sun finally broke through the clouds in the late afternoon, Margaret was exhausted, soaked, shivering from cold and adrenaline. But she was alive. And more than that, she had survived the worst the ocean could throw at her. That night, wrapped in dry blankets, gazing at the stars that now shone in a clear sky, she understood something profound about herself. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about discovering that within her there had always existed a strength she had never needed to access before. Comfortable life, however good it was, had never demanded that of her. The following days were different. Margaret no longer sailed with fear or insecurity. There was a new confidence, a connection with the sea that hadn't existed before. She had passed the test, and 14 days after setting sail, on a lightly foggy morning, she saw it, a dark line on the horizon that gradually became defined. Land, on the other side of the ocean. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face without even trying to hold them back. They weren't tears of relief at having arrived. They were tears of gratitude for having left. When the boat finally docked at a small coastal port on the other side, there were some curious people watching the old vessel arrive. When they saw a white-haired lady, alone, disembarking from the boat with trembling legs but a huge smile on her face, their reaction was one of pure astonishment. "You crossed alone?" asked one of the local fishermen, incredulous. "Alone," Margaret replied, and for the first time in years, she felt genuine pride in herself, not the empty pride of superficial achievements, but the deep pride of someone who faced the impossible and won. In the following weeks, while resting and making final repairs to the boat, Margaret began talking to other sailors who frequented that port, and she discovered something fascinating. She wasn't alone. There was a whole community of people who, at different stages of their lives, had decided to leave everything behind and sail. Some were young people seeking adventure. Others were retirees fulfilling long-held dreams. And they all had one thing in common: the courage to choose to truly live instead of merely existing. But the greatest discovery wasn't about the ocean or about navigation. It was about who she had become in the process. The Margaret who arrived on the other side was not the same one who left. It wasn't just about crossing water. It was about overcoming her own limitations, her own fears, her own excuses. It was about honoring a promise not only to Thomas, but to herself. And in that process, she had reconnected with her own life in a way she never imagined possible at 74 years old. What if the most important journey wasn't to a physical destination, but to the version of yourself that's always been waiting to be discovered? Share the biggest transformation you've ever experienced after facing something impossible, because the impact of this story went far beyond what she herself expected. Margaret's story spread quickly. In small towns, news travels fast, and when people discovered that this 74-year-old woman had crossed the ocean alone in an old boat without prior experience, the reaction was immediate. A local newspaper sent a reporter to interview her. Then came a community radio station, and within weeks, the story had become news on larger portals. 74-year-old woman crosses ocean alone to honor promise to deceased husband. The headline circulated throughout the country. What began as curiosity quickly turned into inspiration. Margaret started receiving messages from people she had never met before. Elderly people saying she had proven that there was still time to pursue their dreams. Young people thanking her for showing what true courage means. Women who had lost husbands and felt lost, saying that her story had lit a light at the end of the tunnel. She had unintentionally become a symbol that it's never too late to start over. Her own children, who had begged her not to go, called her, overcome with emotion, after seeing the news. Her middle daughter cried on the phone, apologizing. "Mom, I was wrong. You weren't crazy. You were being brave, and I couldn't see it." Her eldest son, always the most practical and skeptical, admitted he had underestimated his mother his whole life. "I thought you needed protection, but you were always stronger than any of us." These were words Margaret never imagined hearing, but they healed something deep within her. People started showing up at the port wanting to talk to her, wanting to understand how she found the courage to do this. Margaret, who had always been a simple and reserved woman, suddenly found herself giving advice, sharing her journey, listening to stories from other people who also had shelved dreams. And the most incredible thing was that she didn't speak like someone special or extraordinary. She spoke like an ordinary person who simply decided to stop waiting for permission to live. But the most profound change wasn't how the world came to see her. It was how she came to see herself. Margaret looked in the mirror and recognized someone she hadn't seen in decades. It wasn't about her physical appearance. It was about the sparkle in her eyes, the straighter posture, the confidence in her voice. She had proven to herself that it's never too late to be brave. It's never too late to truly live. And that revelation was priceless. It didn't matter how many articles were written about her or how many people sought her out. What mattered was that she had kept her promise. And in the process, she had rediscovered herself. A few months after the crossing, Margaret was sitting on the deck of the boat she now called home, talking to a young woman in her 30s who had come from far away just to meet her. The young woman was in crisis, feeling she had wasted too much time with wrong choices, that it was too late to change careers, start her life over, and pursue what she truly wanted. Margaret listened silently, with the calm demeanor of someone who had been through a lot, and then said something the young woman would never forget. "The sea doesn't ask your age. It only wants to know if you have the courage to sail it." This phrase sums up everything Margaret learned on this journey. The truth is, the world is full of ready-made excuses for you not to do what you really want. You're too young and lack experience. You're too old, and it's too late. You don't have enough money. You lack the necessary knowledge. You don't have family support. And all these excuses are real, yes, but none of them is greater than the decision to go anyway. Because in the end, what kills dreams isn't the lack of resources or time. It's the lack of courage to start when everything seems impossible. Margaret proved something that society tries to hide from you. It's never too late, never. No matter how old you are, how many times you've failed, how much time you've let slip by. If there's still life, there's still a possibility. If there's still breath, there's still time to honor the promises you made to yourself. And most importantly, to be the person you always wanted to be, but gave up on halfway because someone said it was impractical. Margaret's lesson isn't about navigation. It's not about boats or oceans. It's about looking at your own life and deciding that you won't die wondering, what if? It's about understanding that the opinions of others, however well-intentioned, cannot outweigh the inner voice that calls you to something greater. It's about transforming the pain of loss into fuel to live more intensely. It's about proving to yourself that you are stronger, more capable, more courageous than you ever imagined. And you know what's most beautiful about all this? Margaret didn't make this journey to prove anything to anyone. She did it to honor a promise, to reconnect with her own essence, to feel alive again. But in the process, she ended up proving something to thousands of people who heard her story, that the biggest regret isn't trying and failing, it's never having tried. That age is just a number when you have a true purpose in your heart. And that courage isn't something you're born with. It's something you choose to have every day, especially when nobody believes in you. What is your ocean? What are you putting off that you need to cross? Comment below with the promise you will honor starting today. But before you go, there's something else you need to know about what Margaret is doing now. Today, Margaret continues sailing. She hasn't returned to her old life. She hasn't returned to that empty, silent house where loneliness weighed heavily. She has transformed the boat into her home and decided that she will spend the rest of her life exploring, discovering new places, talking to people she meets along the way. And do you know what she says when people ask if she isn't afraid of being alone at sea? I spent years surrounded by people feeling alone. Now I'm alone at sea and I've never felt so accompanied, because she carries Thomas with her. She carries the fulfilled promise, and she carries the certainty that she has truly lived. If you've made it this far, I know this story touched something deep within you. Maybe you're thinking about that dream you've held on to for years. Maybe you're feeling that tightness in your chest that comes with knowing you need to make a difficult decision. Or maybe you just need to hear that there's still time, that you still can. Write in the comments. This message was for me. If you recognized yourself at any point in this story, I read all the comments, and you can be sure yours will matter. And if you enjoyed this type of content, subscribe to the channel. Every week, I bring you real stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things, proving that life can start over at any time, at any age. These are stories that will make you rethink what's possible, that will give you that push we sometimes need to get out of our rut. Leave a like too, because that helps the video reach more people who need to hear this message today. And look, there's a video right here that you need to watch. It's about another incredible person who decided to start over when everyone thought it was impossible. Click and stay with me there, because I'm sure you'll be even more inspired. See you soon. And remember, your ocean is waiting. The only question is whether you'll have the courage to navigate it.